In this video, we will talk about Python scopes. This is video from series Python for beginners. Please check all previous videos collected in a list specifically about variables and functions to check this one and understand it properly. So links you can find above. So before we start, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave your reactions in the comment. It would really help me and support me to continue do tutorials like this one. So also, if you would have any questions regarding the material, you can freely ask them in the comments and I would be glad to answer and help you with the explanation. So let's talk about scopes. So scopes, it's the place where variables are defined and looked up. Scopes help prevent name clashes across your program code. So names defined in one program unit don't interfere with the names defined in another. So in Python, a scope refers to the region of a program where a variable or function can be accessed. Scopes help to prevent naming conflicts and ensure that variables and functions are used in the appropriate context. So there are 4 types of scopes in Python: local scope, enclosing scope, global scope, and built-in scope. When Python looks for a variable or function, it first looks in the local scope, then in the enclosing scope, then the global scope, and finally the built-in scope. If the variable or function is not found in any of these scopes, Python will raise a name error. It is important to understand and use scopes correctly in order to write efficient and organized Python code. So let me show you all these scopes in the example and explain it a bit more deeply. So let's start with the local scope. So local scope, it's the variables that are defined within a function. They are considered to be in the local scope. These variables can only be accessed within the function. So let's create an example. I already prepared some examples here. I'm using PyCharm Community Edition to show all of them. Example, if you're just starting with Python, it would be enough for you. It's absolutely free. So let's check the example about local scope. So in this example, the variable x, we created my function and then we defined our variable x inside this function. So it means that these variables are in the local scope. So we have the print statement that is also within the same function, so it can access the value of x and output it to the console. So for example, let's run our function and see what it does. So you see in the result we have 10 because our variable x is 10. But for example, if we will create just a new function with no arguments, and for example, we would like to use this x in these new functions, we will not be like x plus 10, and for example, our result equal x plus 10, return, or we will just print it, print result. So you saw that even PyCharm is showing that there is some error here. So if we will run this new function, so we'll comment this out, it will not be run, and we will run this new function, we would see that Python gives us a name error because name x is not defined for the scope of this function, so we cannot use it inside this function. So this is what is meant how the local scope is working. Let's check the enclosing scope. And then we will return to this one and make it work. I will show you how to do that. But let's return to the enclosing scope. Let's check the enclosing scope. The variables that are defined in outer function and used in an inner function are in the enclosing scope. These variables can be accessed by both the outer and inner functions. So if you could see, we created 2 functions, outer function, and inside this function we declared our variable x. And then inside this function, we created a new function and we use this x. And it can be used because these variables are in enclosing scope. So if we will run this example, you would see that we print 10 here, and we can print it here as well. It can be used in the both functions. So if we will run it again, you would see that we have 10 and 10 here. But for example, if we will reassign our variable inside this outer function to, for example, 20, then the result would be different, because Python will firstly check for the local variable in this function, and for this function local variable of x would be 20 but not 10 anymore. So if we will run it, you would see that this will print 10 and this would print 20, because we just created the local variable and the local variables are checked first. If we remove this part, we would use the enclosed variable and both will be the same. Next one is the global scope. Global scope is when variables that are defined outside of any functions and they are considered to be in the global scope. These variables can be accessed from anywhere in the code, but don't be fooled by the word global here. Names at the top of level of a file are global to code with this single file. So it means that we can use this variable without any problems just in this file that is named global for us, not in the others. To use it in the other, we need to import the module. So there is really no notion of a single all-encompassing global file-based scope in Python. Instead, names are partitioned into modules, and you must always import a module explicitly if you want to be able to use the names its file defines. So when you hear global in Python, you can think module. So let's check our example here. In this example, the variable is defined outside of any function. So you can see a variable is defined outside of any function. So it's in the global scope. So then my function is able to access the value of x and output it in the console. So if we will run this global example, you would see that we just printed this x, and you see that we didn't define it not inside the function, so we don't have a local variable for that, we don't have enclosing variables for that, so that is why we take global variable. You can also create a new function. If you remember our example with the local before, I will show it here. So we created this function. But if we will add, for example, 20, so in this case, for this function, x would be 10 because we have it defined locally. But for this function, x would be 20 because we have defined it globally. So if we'll run it again, we will not have an error anymore. We would have, we would use both functions. We will run both functions, so we would have that our first function will print x as 10 and the other will print as 30 because 20 plus 10 is 30. This is how you see how this LEGB rule is working. LEGB means local first, then enclosing, then global, and then built-in. So Python checks whether this variable are present in the local scope, and it's presented, so that is why it stands for this one. In this case, it checks whether x is presented in the local scope, and we see that it's not. Where the x presented in the enclosing scope? No. Then we check for the global scope, and we got the result here. And the last thing is the built-in modules. So built-in scopes, this is scopes that contains all the built-in functions and modules in Python. So these functions and modules can be accessed from anywhere in the code. So again, when Python looks for a variable or function, it firstly looks in the local scope, then in the enclosing scope, then the global scope, and finally the built-in scope. If the variable or function is not found in any of these scopes, Python will raise a name error. So it's important to understand and use scopes correctly in order to write efficient and organized code. But it's not the end. Let me show you a few more things that you could do in Python. There is also another way let me just show in our local example. There is another way to create global in Python, and you can do it inside the function by using global. So let's modify our example here. So we will just add global x. So it means that you want to use this global variable inside this function. You can just create it or change it. So in our case, we will change it. So if we will run the result again, if you remember, this was 10 and here what result 30. Now it would be different, and you see it's 10 and 20. And the reason why, because we not used local variable x here, we used global x and we change it to 10, and then we change it for this function as well, because we called this function before this one. Note that modifying global variables inside a function can lead to an unexpected behavior and make the code harder to understand and debug. It's generally a better practice to avoid using global variables when possible, and instead pass values between functions as arguments and return values. So don't use it if you really don't need it, because it would be complicated to understand and work with the code. Also, there is some one another thing that we could use. It's called nonlocal. Let me show it to you in the example. So in this example, we have an outer function here that defines a variable x with value 10. We also have an inner function, and here we can modify our x to 20 using the non-local keyword. So how we would write non-local x, and then we will modify it x equal to 20. So when we call inner function from within the outer function, it modifies the value of x in enclosing scope and print it to the console. Oops, let me run this one. So you see that here it was 10, then we change it and print it as 20. But if we will print this, we will do this print after we call this inner function, we would see that this x has changed for both. So let me run it. You would see that we will have 20 and 20. So when we call print outside the function, it prints also the new value of x, which is also 20, because we just changed it using this non-local keyword. Note that the non-local keyword can only be used to access variables in the immediately enclosing scope. If the variable is not defined in the immediate enclosing scope, the non-local keyword cannot be used and access it. Additionally, the non-local keyword can only be used within a nested function and cannot be used in the global scope. So in summary, understanding the concept of scope and the LEGB rule is important for writing an effective and bug-free Python code. So let's repeat this LEGB rule one more time. It means that when Python looks for a variable or function, it firstly looks for the local scope L, then for enclosing scope E, then for the global scope G, and finally the built-in scope. If the variable is not found, we will get the value error. By properly managing the scope of variables in our code, we can avoid naming conflicts, improve the clarity and maintainability of our code, and write more efficient and effective programs. So that is all about scopes. I hope you got the idea. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. If you would need some consultation, you can ask for it in the comments as well. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments. And remember, knowledge is our superpower. Bye-bye.